Hello to everybody and welcome. My name is Heath and I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the Morrow Memorial Library. I'd like to extend many thanks to our community partners tonight, Progress Norwood and Together Yes. Katie Neal Rizzo with Progress Norwood is here with us tonight. Katie, do you have anything that you'd like to talk about before we get started, or do you just want to say hello and pass on?
Just hi, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. And we won't have any sustainability series talk for December. We're going to take the month off because it's a busy month, but we will be back full force in January. So stay tuned to the library's website for details on that.
And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Tory Stephens. Tory Stephens creates opportunities that transform organizations and shift culture. He's a resource generator and community builder for social justice issues, people, and movements. He currently works at Fix, Grist's Solutions Lab, as their network weaver and climate fiction creative manager, and uses storytelling to champion climate justice and imagine green, clean, and just futures. Tory, welcome, and thank you so much for your time tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Heath. Really appreciate this. This is one of the, I do a lot for my work, and this is one of the things I like the most is to talk to people about clean, green, and just solutions. And so today we're going to be talking about how climate storytelling, like fictional storytelling, can be a climate solution. Typically, in the last 3 years, what I've been doing is the organization, let me just start by saying the organization I work at is called Grist. It's a media organization that's focused on the climate crisis and getting us out of the climate crisis and reporting. So it's a news organization. But the wing that I come out of, the program that is nestled inside of Grist is called Fix, and it's a solutions lab, a climate solutions lab. And unlike Grist, where we're beholden, Grist, I work at Grist, but they, and I say they because it's like the newsroom side of things, they're beholden to the news cycle. So if Joe Biden fired the head of the EPA, it's something I care about, but the writers on my staff and team, we wouldn't write about that because it's like something that's timely and newsy. What we focus on is climate solutions, and we're solely focused on that. We really want to deliver and have the public understand what are these solutions? What is a heat pump? What is, why is solar technology important, and how can it be better if there's like a new model coming online? And then we do another thing that I think is really exciting, and that's we talk about the people behind those solutions. So we'll have like a kelp farmer who is, putting like huge sea kelp farms into the ocean and sequestering a lot of carbon. And we will, not just tell you about what that person does, but why they're passionate about it and where they came from. Like, I grew up in Maine, and I've been fishing with my dad forever, and I saw the fisheries like being destroyed from the climate and how lobster traps weren't yielding as much. So we'll really do a deep dive into the person. And I think that part of Fix is why I ended up on the team. A little bit about me. Before I ended up in the climate space, I was in the health advocacy space. And oh yeah, let me mention before I get going here about who I am and delivering this information around climate solutions and storytelling. There was some housekeeping I wanted to do at the top that we discussed a minute ago, which is that if you have any questions, I'm totally comfortable with you jumping off of like unmuting and just being like, wait, can you stop there? I want to ask a question about something. But if you're one of those like shy people who don't want to interrupt someone and you want to wait till there's like a moment to do that, we'll also have 15 minutes at the end where that will be allotted for like a question and answer session. But I don't mind if you like break in and you're like, wait, Tory, stop. I want to can we talk about that? What did you say? Can you slow down or whatever? So just wanted to get that out of the way. Now, back to the story I was going to tell around my career and where I started. I wasn't in the environmental space 3 years ago. I was actually, for a long time, I'd been a fundraiser, and that's why when Heath was reading my bio said resource generator. That's how I describe it these days. But the common term is fundraiser. And so while I was a fundraiser, I started actually when email was kind of like, it was the thing, like social media wasn't really the thing, using like ads on other spaces, that was a thing, but it was really email and actual letters. I may look young, but I'm not. So I used to send 65,000 letters for HIV and AIDS for folks who have that. And also to protect folks against like getting HIV and AIDS. So we would send 65,000 letters out a quarter. So we had stories that we had to produce, right? And so who was the guy that was there trying to figure out what story we should, highlight so that people could be excited and, want to donate funds for HIV and AIDS? That was me. And the big argument at the time that I was trying to push, I heard of this website. Maybe you have come across it. It's kind of old school now, but a lot of people know it. It's called Humans of New York. And it kind of, it was on Facebook, and the website's like this website where this guy, he's a photographer, but he also is a curious person. And he just would ask a New Yorker, a random one, like, tell me your story, like really deep dive, like you're just a random person, but everybody is interesting. That was his philosophy. And I thought, wow, what if we could do that in fundraising? Because what we were leaning on at the time were statistics. Like, hey, if you give your money, we'll be able to make sure that 100,000 people have the PrEP, which is like this medicine that makes it so that it blocks HIV from people from getting HIV. Or we'd say, like, we're trying to educate, 100,000 Massachusetts students. Like, it was always about statistics and not about a person. And after reading Humans of New York and seeing how like that took off in like millions, I mean, it was viral like every other week on some story just on a regular person that was on the street. And I kept insisting that that's where we needed to shift our fundraising appeals. And so I'll tell a little bit about how this becomes relevant to the climate work that I do now. But essentially, it's like believing in the power of story to motivate people. Like, I started to gather and gain steam around this idea. And then I started to come into work and be like, no, we need to shift things. Like, the statistics leaning, I think will motivate people to give more money. And so lo and behold, my boss was like, okay, we're going to try this thing. And so we focused on one person. I'll call them Brenda to protect their identity here. But we focused on one person, not all these like 100,000, this. It was just like, can you help Brenda? Brenda has HIV, is struggling with finding a place to live and has trouble with healthcare. And it was a real story. It wasn't one that we made up. I interviewed Brenda, which was someone who's receiving services from the HIV/AIDS clinic that I worked at. And we got 10% more donations that time. So then I believed in it more. And then, fast forward into another job, I switched working for an organization that was a HIV/AIDS advocacy organization for a health advocacy organization, national, to protect Obamacare, or as is the real name is the Affordable Care Act, and the ACA, and also to protect Medicaid and Medicare. And the same thing at that organization, they were leaning on statistics, and I was the guy that was brought in to lean on storytelling. And so I ended up at Grist to bring on a storytelling team, but actually as a network weaver. So they have a network of these folks, these really incredible individuals that we call solutionaries, because they're climate solution focused. We call them fixers too. And if you look on our website, we behind the scenes call them solutionaries because we like that word. But we call them, hey, they made the Grist 50 list, which is like the Forbes 50, but not for capitalism. And instead it's focused on environmentalism and climate solutions and climate justice. And so we put out this list every year, and I was brought in to gel that community. There's 50 people every year, have them go to retreats and learn from each other and basically create a community out of it. And one time, the founder of Grist said, I really want to do something that's different, because there's so many people that are activated by the news, but there's a lot of people that have turned off and just are like tuned out from the news. he was talking about buddies, and you know, he had like this informal poll going with family and friends around like how many people don't listen to the news, and then they put some money behind it to get some polling done. And lo and behold, there's a good amount of people who just like, they really don't, the news doesn't activate or motivate them, and other things motivate them, like a movie they saw, fiction, a play. Like they named all sorts of things, everything but politics and news. All that stuff was kind of like divisive and just not motivating them. It actually just turned them off. And you know, we're interested in talking to people about the climate crisis because it's going to take all of us to get out of the crisis. And so we don't want any people on the sidelines. So we were like, he came to me, the founder of Grist. His name is Chip Giller. And he said, I think that climate fiction would be a good way to go. And it was funny for me because I as a storyteller, I should have been like, yeah, that is true. But I was really came from the short termism of policy driven things where people really need that healthcare right now. They really need that HIV AIDS medicine now. And so I was like, no, we need to fix these things now. Like, because the climate fiction work that he wanted to focus on was something where people could vision what the future could be in the long, like way out in the future. That's why the project that I manage is called Imagine 2200. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I wanted to set the scene first. And so I was like, okay, let's bring these folks together, that with the Grist 50 folks, and let's talk about climate fiction, and let's see if they think it's a good idea, and we can do some visioning around what a particular program at Grist would look like. So we brought people together at the beginning of the pandemic. We talked about climate fiction. We talked about what's missing from the climate movement. And lo and behold, you know, we had a lot of interesting, you know, movement building, justice focused people there. And there were so many, what many environmentalists would call adjacent things. You know, people on the front lines are not going to call these adjacent, but many people who are from the old school environmentalism, you know, you focus on the earth, you focus on the animals. It really wasn't like, if you look at the 70s, Save the Whales, where are the people in this kind of discussion? So this is different. You know, a lot of the justice folks now are like, we're not going to do that. So if you have a climate fiction contest or initiative out of Grist, it's going to be heavy focus on, yes, we need to save the people, the planet. Yes, we need to save our non-human kin, but we also have to have people at the center of these stories as well, because like, you know, humans are valuable and important, you know, and we need to, you know, care about them too. And the environmental movement had already made many mistakes about not focusing on frontline communities. And just a little background there, if I say like a frontline community, what I'm talking about is like where environmental impacts are the most acute. So if you look at Cancer Alley in Louisiana, where there is oil refineries next to people's homes, and oil refineries and plastic companies that are chemically heavy right next to people's homes, where the chemicals of the oil refinery and the plastic have seeped into their water, and it's caused so much cancer that the place has a name that it's called Cancer Alley. And that's just like one example of like a frontline community. Another frontline community would be like Puerto Rico or Trinidad and Tobago, where although they didn't create the, they didn't contribute heavily to the climate crisis, they're going to feel the disproportionate effect of the climate crisis just due to their location and how our Earth works. So in the conversations, this visioning that we had with these wonderful people from all around the United States focused on climate solutions, the facilitator that I was working with at the time had a background that I don't have a background in, and which was that he grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I was like, how can this be helpful? And he was like, no, we're going to make a game where people get to the goal, that goal you want of the clean, green, and just world. We're going to put 4 people in a Zoom room for 2 days, not for like straight, but like over the course of 2 days. And they're going to play a game that we designed, and it was called Imagine 2200. And the goal of the game was to be put in a room with 4 people that you don't know that well, but they all have climate solution experience in their own kind of way. Whether one could be like a solar person, another person could be like, again, that kelp farmer, Another person could be someone who's an activist trying to shut down gas, factories or refineries or whatever, or LNG facilities as they would call them. And so we did that over the course of, we had a total of 30 people, and they played out this better D&D game, or like a different version that was focused on getting to a clean, green, and just world. And what we found when we looked at the timelines of the different things that you would have to do, some were very conflict driven, where it was like, you're going to have to take over the oil companies, like with force. Others were, not like that. It was about the political system, but they all got to this clean, green, and just world in different ways. In all those like learnings that I was glossing over, Chip said, I want you to look at these, and then I want you to build the bones for a climate fiction initiative at Grist. And so after looking at all that stuff, after having all those conversations, where I landed was that we're going to have an initiative that is focused on a clean, green, and just world. We want to figure out how you get to that. So the contest isn't going to be about something dystopian and about how the world, how we didn't show up and how we didn't tackle these problems. I want to know, like, I want to have fictional stories that are hopeful, that are focused on climate solutions, that honor the frontline communities that are living on the front line because of the effects of the Western world, and primarily. So, after 6 months of workshopping it, on January of 2021, we launched Imagine 2200, the first climate fiction initiative out of Grist that was focused on hope, climate solutions, and intersectional characters. People that have multiple levels of, or identities to themselves. Like, we're not all just like this one way. Some people, you're a mom in one life, but a nurse in another. You're a gay man, and you're a Black man, and you're from Trinidad and Tobago. We want to hear the characters to be that rich, because my friends are that rich, my families are that rich. They're not just I always say this thing, when I'm talking to writers about them submitting their stories, what kind of stories you're looking for? And I always say, I'm looking for stories that don't have Lego people. And so what I mean by that is, with a Lego character, you can just swap the heads and they're always just yellow, right? I want colorful characters like life gives us. And I don't want to just if I can swap the head of the individual and put it on another character, and you don't, nothing's lost. You're not oh, that doesn't make sense because that character is Brazilian and he wouldn't be doing this. Where's the food? All those things that come with the character would come with the character if I switched, but with Lego people, it doesn't matter. So I just want really rich characters in this initiative. So fast forward after a lot of Twitter marketing for 3 months, and pushing the idea that we're looking for these intersectional climate fiction stories at Grist, we knocked it out of the park. My boss said that she would be excited if we only got 200 stories in the first year. We got 1,100 stories from 85 countries and knocked it out of the park. It was people are hungry for telling stories around hope, around climate solutions, around deep, rich, intersectional characters that have real cultural authenticity. And so we brought some artists together to make the covers for each of those stories. And we had reviewers, 3 reviewers, and they had a grueling process in front of them because we got way more stories than they thought they would. But these were some of the top people in the game. They came from the climate fiction world, which is something, to be honest, I didn't know about 3 years ago. When I was working in the healthcare industry, I was oh, I'm going to be working at this news organization. I did not think that I would be doing fiction eventually after. If you had asked me 3 years ago if I would be in the fiction world, I would have said no way. There's just not where I could see myself. But now I feel really comfortable in this space and really happy to kind of advocate for climate fiction stories. So yeah, we got 1,100 stories from 85 countries. The reviewers stepped up their game and just we had to change the system a little bit, but they essentially, we disqualified 200 stories because they just weren't the type of stories we were looking for. And then they had to read 300 stories each in the matter of a month and a half. They're short stories, and they are anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 words. And we try to honor reading all of them. They can tell pretty much maybe 6 pages in if a story is not going to like hold, you know? So we gave them that authority to kind of like cut stories because we had so many. Now we're staffing up so that we can like really read them and give them a thorough read, but we did a really good job. We came out with 20, they then hand off 20 stories to the judges, and our esteemed judges, which included Adrienne Marie Brown. I don't know if you know Adrienne Marie Brown, but she wrote the book Pleasure Activism and a ton of other really great activist books that just have really changed how people look at activism. Like pleasure activism, that it should be joyful when you're doing this work. Yeah, so we came out with 20 stories, handed off those to the judges, and we came out with these 12 really beautiful stories of climate fiction, which do something different than some of the climate fiction that's out there. I love climate fiction that's out there. Kim Stanley Robinson has a new book, or it's slightly new, about like a year old. It's Ministry of the Future. And it's a great book if you want to check out some climate fiction. There's a lot of climate fiction in that space, but a lot of it tends to be dystopian. The one I just mentioned wasn't. It's just a book that a lot of people know, so I thought maybe I'd drop that one, by Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote the story Mars, which the book maybe you've heard of that. It's a movie with like Matt Damon now, a couple of years old, but he's a really known writer. And so this genre, climate fiction, that the space that I'm playing in, is something that it's a growing genre, mainly because it was a subgenre for a long time. But because the climate crisis is such a significant thing, you know, a lot of stories that wouldn't even be classified, maybe even the writer just wrote the story as a true account of what's happening, but like it's fiction, but they're pulling from real life. It ends up becoming a climate fiction story because they're using what's happening in real life now. And that's such a major story. But one of the things I like to talk about these major stories is that although climate fiction or the climate crisis is such a big story and such a big thing in this planet, what's not happening is the stories aren't filtering into kind of like the popular lexicon, even outside of like fiction. Like look at Hollywood. I always do this with a crowd and of people, and I say like, think of the last 5 shows that you love, that you're like, oh, I'm gonna recommend this to a friend. I wanna watch this with my partner. Like, it's so good. Like, I just can't stop talking about it. Now think about, is the climate any part of the plot of that story? And the reason I can be very certain that the plot is not a part of the story is because there's some really good studies out there by, there's one just recently, Yale does them at their climate communication organization or program that they have at Yale. And then also the good energy folks who are working in Hollywood have done some really good analysis over the screenplays that are going through all the streaming sites. It's 2%. 2% of the stories that you watch have a climate at the heart of it, like where they either talk about climate, they talk about climate change. They used all these terms, these keywords, and they fed them into a computer to look at all the screenplays and writing on streaming services for the last like 10 or 15 years. And what they found was only 2% talk about this thing that's so important. It's like, it's just, wow. It's hard to believe. So this is why we're at Grist advocating for more climate solution storytelling. And this is why we, excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold. And this is why we're advocating for more climate solution focused stories, because it's not even happening even in a strong way. And then even if you break it down a little bit further, when you look at the type of, when climate fiction shows up, you have these like either dystopian or like almost thriller movies where the climate itself is like weaponized and like going after all the characters. It's not about how we get out of the crisis. And like, I'm not gonna knock dystopian stories. Like I love those stories, but I'm just asking for, can we have some hope? Can we have some hopeful stories? And so my job is to go out there and advocate for storytellers, writers, and screenplay writers and others to switch what they're doing. We'll try something different this time. Like, so the contest does that in one way, but that's only 12 stories that we can publish on an annual basis. It's really cool that 1,100 people submitted their stories, and actually have gotten a lot of letters or emails, I guess, not letters these days, but emails from people that have said, I'm really glad you did this because I've been writing this kind of certain way for a long time. And this challenged me as a writer to write differently. It challenged me to look at my characters and see if they're reaching a wide audience or a diverse audience. It challenged me to not always write in a dystopian way. You know, you can write about hope. And it challenged me to embed climate solutions into the stories. So that's a little bit about, like, you know, my background and where I come from, the how we got into climate fiction, I think, which is a really interesting thing, and then what we're doing in the space now. And so this is we just published year 2, so we have 2 collections. And every year I can say that these stories are really interesting. You know, when you pull from such a wide pool, you're going to get some really cool stories. And just to give you a taste of some of the stories that, if you'd like to read, I won't spoil them. I'll just give like kind of a quick, hey, this is what you'll find. Excuse me. But what you'll find is like there's one story, Broken from the Colony, which I think is really beautiful because the word colony is playing, you know, it's actually working in 3 ways. So it's talking about coral reefs, and I guess they're explained as a colony. So that's one way. It's talking about the colonization of the Bahamas or Bermuda, one of the islands down there. And then also of our bodies, because the character is a trans character. And it was really also, I got letters too after the story was published. It was like, people just reached out to me that were, you know, either trans masculine or trans femme, that said, this is great. I like climate fiction, but I have not seen many characters out there that are experiencing what I'm experiencing. And that part of it is why we do this, right? So at the beginning, I was talking about reaching people about, like, how can climate fiction be a climate solution? If people can't see themselves in the story of coming up and showing up for the solutions, how are they going to show up and feel comfortable in those spaces? So by creating a fictional world where people feel comfortable in those spaces, they feel comfortable in other spaces. They can see themselves as a climate solutionary, right? And so my goal now is to publish more stories. And I just got the green light, because the collection has been successful, that Grist is going to invest in publishing more stories. So not only will we have the contest, but we're going to be like a regular place where people can show up and just look for, you know, really cool short stories, like, you know, your science fiction website or whatever, but ours will be focused on climate fiction. Another interesting story that this one really threw me for a loop, and I wasn't a total advocate and I had to come on board, but I did see how it was an important story later. It's not I can't make a decision as to what stories get in. I'm not a judge. I'm not a reviewer. I'm at the discussion table when we're discussing the stories, like the value of them and like how great they are. But at the end of the day, when they say like, I want these stories to go through, the reviewers do that. And then the judges make that decision. But on the sidelines, I can like make comments or whatever. And so we got a story about a person submitted a story that is Wiccan. And, you know, that is a religion of some folks. And so lo and behold, but the story wasn't just about being Wiccan. It was also about a person going through a miscarriage. In this story was a climate fiction story, but it was also about being a woman and a person who gives birth and could have a miscarriage. And so I thought that was like, you know, it was hard to see how it was a climate fiction story, because it's like, there's a lot of the story that's not about the climate, but it's set in the world where the climate has changed. And it is a climate fiction story. And some people even called it a lunar punk story. I could talk a little bit, and I will talk about solar punk in a minute. I'll transition to that because it's an interesting group of people that I've made, friends and community with that have been doing what I would call is the OG. They're the OG climate fiction people. They've been doing it for a while, just in small subculture. But this Wiccan story that is about this person who goes through a miscarriage, really like people, again, I receive feedback from these because like we push these stories out into the world, and then they, get out there and people share them and they end up on blogs and people reach out. And I wasn't expecting how many people like really were like, yo, this is great. I feel seen. Like, thank you. Like, women go through this and it's not in the stories like of climate fiction. I'm sure you're going to find this in stories like in fiction. But other people have said, like, even in fiction, it's not something that is discussed as much as it should be when it's something that is very common. It's not a nice subject, but books are raw. Books are about real life and what we go through. And people, it turned out to be a really amazing story. That story, I think, was number 5 or 4 from the first year. It's called Canvas, Wax, Moon. Canvas, Wax, Moon. It's a really cool story about a family that comes together for this woman in a time of need under a climate crisis. But her particular crisis is this moment that she's tackling. So that's just like a taste of some of the stories. Some of the people that have shown up or communities that have made their way to me or made their way to us, or I've looked at them and read their stories that I would really suggest that you check out if you're, I guess if you're on this Paul, you're into fiction or climate or both, is this term that I just threw around, which is called solar punk. And so solar punk folks believe in, and I would say that's the interesting thing about the solar punk movement is it truly is a movement beyond just a genre. It's not just in the fictional space. It is an aesthetic. It is also an artistic movement. It is also a community of people that have been pushing for climate solutions. So these folks, they believe in using the power of fiction and art to show the world that we actually want. Sometimes they're considered like utopian, not all the time, but sometimes. I would also say that the project that I'm managing, Imagine 2200, at times is considered utopian, but that's not what we're totally looking for. We do like when it shows the struggle to get to the clean, green, just world. But the solar punks, yeah, so there's a lot of affinity there. They believe in an equitable society. They believe in climate solutions being embedded in like our everything. That technology is a strong solution, but it's not the only solution. That the environment itself, and how do you like make technology work so that it's working in tandem in helping our environment, not working against it, is a big theme. And so I've made allies and again friends with them. We Imagine was won an award in the first year. We won 2 awards actually. One of them was from the solar punk community, the Solar Punk magazine, which is out there and which has really great stories that you could get a flavor for what solar punk is. I think they're on their 4th year or 4th cycle of producing stories, but there's a lot of really cool stories that they have if you're interested in these kind of works. And yeah, so I suggest them. And then outside of just, them, we won a journalism award for innovation in the journalism space, which was really exciting and really affirming from this place called Covering Climate Now, which like they give great awards. Like we beat the New York Times in climate reporting last year. And then the innovation space, we also beat like everyone, which was amazing. And for it to be something that I was managing in the first year is like just, I don't know, it was like jumping up and down in my house when I found out. So the solar punks are folks that I would suggest you check out as well. Like if you're looking for this stuff, if this talk that I've given and has whet your appetite for this kind of fiction that is focused on solutions and equitable solutions, ones that hold people in their cultures in a true and beautiful way, I would say you check out them because they're really masterful at this. the difference there between climate fiction is climate fiction can also be dystopian. Solar punk cannot. It is just not in their bones. They will not do dystopian. That's just not what they do. Their whole focus is on, what does the end result look like, and what would it look like if we lived in this beautiful world that is clean, green, and just, and in right relationship with our non-human kin. And some of the stories that are definitely in this collection are considered like solar punk, and some of them aren't. They don't have that kind of like style. But the way that they bridge the gap between all of them is none of our stories are dystopian. So you're not going to get like a one of these like kind of thriller, scary kind of, the climate's destroying us and I don't know if we're going to make it. And that's like the tale that's being told so that we can react in that way. I want to use hope as a tool to motivate people. And that's something I'm interested in exploring. And then, so there's these other folks that I learned about when I started dealing with so since the project deals with so far in the future, imagine 2200, what we ask people to write about is not about today. We ask them to write about, it can be any day after today, like it can be 5 days from now, really, but most people know because the title is Imagine 2200. We're talking about what does the future look like? How do we get to that clean, green, and just world? And the way that we frame it, and we talk about solar punk, we talk about Afrofuturists as well, because this project has been described as a futurist project because it's looking so deep in the future. So I don't know if you know, but I can explain a little bit. Afrofuturists are also a movement. They're a little bit more than solar punk in that they span into music as well. There's some jazz folks that were actually some of the first Afrofuturists. So if you're interested in Afrofuturism, they are a movement just like solar punk was. It's one that we look to for some inspiration, and we've embedded some of the terminology so that we can like kind of raise a flag to be like, hey, Afrofuturists, come over here, play in this space, write for climate fiction. And some of them already write what I would call as, focus on the climate crisis. So, and we have 5 minutes until question and answers. So I just wanted to say that. But the Afrofuturists are really cool in that they're focused on, what does a world look like when it's not for the white gaze and it's it's for Black people. This, that doesn't mean that you can't read it. It just means that like when we're writing to uplift Black folk and show them in the light that we want to be shown. And that, as Adrienne Maree Brown always says, is that, what's going to be in the future? Black people will be in the future. And Afrofuturists say that because if you look at sci-fi stories and movies for the longest time, like Black people will be like adjacent or maybe killed off in movies like really quickly, or just not even that. Like you will find Lego people. You'll find like a Black character and his skin color is Black and he's Black and his name might be Black, but they don't go that deeper on who this, like his Blackness doesn't show up in the story. Stories are getting way better at that these days, and you have a lot more diversity in storytelling. But the Afrofuturism was slightly a response to the lack of, dreaming about the future where Black people are there, Black and brown people, I should say. And so, yeah, I would definitely check that out. And lo and behold, after I found out about Afrofuturism, there's also other futurisms that have born from what Afrofuturists did. So there's Indigenous futurism, there's Latinx futurism, Gulf futurism, which is like the Middle East. There's less of that work out there, but there's people kind of moving in that space to kind of do the same thing that the Afrofuturists do. And so with all this that we're doing, again, the goal is to activate people who are turned off from the news, who don't get their orientation from, just what is going on the news every day. Like, they just don't care about that. They'd rather read a good book to get their orientation. And so if that's the case for a good amount of people out there, enough people, we want to reach them. And so that was Grist's response, is that we want to create a program that speaks to those folks, and we do it in a diverse ways. The contest is international, So we reach, like, we've had people, again, 85 countries showed up in the first year. I think it was a little less yet the second year, but not by much. And, you know, we've had detective stories from Malaysia. We've had a Jamaican story that's, there's a lot of Jamaican patois in the story. And it's really nice. And, you know, I talked about earlier about people, you know, the Wiccan story where the woman has a miscarriage, that's like, you know, people can see themselves in that story. Well, better believe Jamaicans have been like, what? A climate fiction story at Grist that has Jamaican patois? What are you doing? I'm so happy. Like, they are in my inbox, and honestly, I live for that. That's like the really cool part about this. I'm trying to reference some other stories that we had a like a Norwegian mythical story that, like, actually it's one of the only stories that moves back in time. They kind of broke the model of what we the stories focus on the future, but because it goes back to like a communist mine that her father worked in. So there's visions of back then, but then this like reindeer, and I don't want to give it away, but there's like a reindeer that's really about like the Norse, Nordic kind of like indigenous folks up there. It's a dynamic story. It's called Secret Powers. That's another one. So those are the rich stories. We really want people's culture to show up because it keeps ringing in my ear. Not just that Black people will be in the future, but culture will be in the future. You often see these like sanitized stories in science fiction where somebody's on a ship and they're in suits, matching suits, maybe blue. It's kind of like a jumpsuit, but like, where's the culture's devoid? They have like this food that comes out of a microwave, and like, it's like, we can have the future, right? But just because of the future, that's why I like Star Wars in some ways. Yes, I'm a Star Wars geek. I'll like label that. But the reason is because you see all this culture that they made up, because each of those like different aliens or different kinds of people, sorry about that, they have a culture, and they show it in that. And I think that's what was attractive about Star Wars, that it wasn't the sanitized thing, and that there are cultures in the story. So I guess I'll stop there so we can like take some questions. But yeah, this is kind of like the things that I talk about on a daily basis with people. How do you get stories? How are stories a form of climate solutions? And I hope that I was able to share with you how story can activate people, especially people that feel turned off from the news or don't feel represented in the stories that are being told.
I would like to say that I have not watched the news since September 11th, 2001, because it's repeatedly traumatizing and was bringing nothing into my life but anxiety and more fear, and draining me of the ability to enjoy anything and not picture just catastrophe everywhere. And I think that the pandemic that we just went through, even if you didn't watch the news, even if you were keeping the TV off, you just hear it everywhere. So these, and being in the environmental volunteer arena, it's hard to find anything that is hopeful. So I think that was something that was so refreshing with these short stories, is that there is so much hope, and it draws you in. Whereas I don't want to turn on the news because I don't want to see more about climate change and how disastrous it is, and how we only have however many years to turn this thing around before we're all screwed. But the ideas and the hope that come from these stories was really refreshing and inspiring. And I think that it would be interesting. My brother is a creative writing teacher, a high school teacher, and I'm always think of these things through my children's eyes and how they would see things. And it would be so interesting to see how children's climate future creative writing stories would, like, what ideas they would come up with as well. I had Cub Scout troop that I lead meet with one of our town leaders and talk about recycling yesterday and waste management and where all the trash is going to go. And just in that 30 minutes, they came up with some stuff that I was like, wow, that's a really good idea. So it's so interesting to hear these creative minds coming up with possible fixes, as opposed to always these science-minded people who are very concrete in there. This is the science, and this is what we have to do, and the CO2 and the trapping, and to bring the creative minds into the realm of fixing is really refreshing and inspiring.
Yeah, in the thing you said about the children is something that we would love to do. It's something that keeps, every time we have like a, debrief around how did it go this year? What would we like to do different? Like the number like 1, 2, or 3 thing ends up being create a contest for younger people because they're going to have some really interesting stuff that will be really different than what adults are focused on. Right now, we just don't have the resources to manage 2 contests that are like, it's really hard just managing this one. But I think like if we did get a big grant or some resources, it would be like, again, it would be like one of the either 1, 2, or like if we had, it would be close. Because I know there's some people that would be like, let's just produce more of what we're doing. Because we get those 1,000 stories, we'd love to publish. Like I didn't mention this, but I would say that like the hardest thing was like the last 125 stories were all like they easily could have been number 4, 5, 6, 7, like, so we're leaving a lot of really great stories on the cutting floor, I guess, to use a film analogy.
Tori, I have a question. As a librarian, obviously looking to add diversity to our collections and make sure that these kind of new, rich, and up-and-coming voices are being heard and everything. Do you know if any of the people who have published with you have been picked up by more traditional publishing houses? Do you know if that's the case?
Yeah, and that's something I should have mentioned. The great thing another thing I like about this project is we've been able to attract first-time writers, like that story that I told you about that's called Broken from the Colony, that's a trans writer. The writer is also trans, not just the character in the story. That was the first story they've ever written, like where they submitted. So we have folks that are like what you would call emerging writers, but then we also have a story. This gentleman won in year 1 and also in year 2. Didn't win number 1, but ended up in the 12-person collection. His name is Rich Larson. He won an Emmy like the same year that he submitted to us. And so that's what's really cool. In the collection, you'll see a few people that have like stories that are in books. And then you'll see people that are just like, you know what, I've never written, but I'm going to go for it. And they actually ended up, and that happened both years. They're not all published seasoned writers in the first or the second collection, but their stories are just so good that they deserve to be there. But I will also can mention this now because it actually is not a secret anymore, is that we landed a book deal for the collection. So the Imagine 2200 is going to be a book that you can buy in February 7th to be exact. I'm like counting the days. And I can share the link. Heath, I think that your library should have it. So we can talk about that offline. And yeah, so all the stories will be accessible, and I'm looking for a book deal either with the same publisher. I think they want to see how it goes because anthologies are a pretty tough sell. They're harder to sell usually. But we do have Adrienne Marie Brown along with a lot of outstanding judges that have offered blurbs, and Adrienne wrote the foreword to the book. And yeah, so I'm hopeful, but we'll see. But yeah, I can give you a list of solar punk presses, like World Weaver Press, that has some really interesting books out there that are solar punk books that are published. So a lot of the people that are published are reviewers and judges too, the ones that we've had. Excuse me.
Thank you, that's great.
Is
Yes.
a
Oh, sorry.
main-
Just wanted.
Sorry, go ahead.
I saw Susan's comment and I totally agree. Yeah, that's another thing that just around the children is like, some people are really excited for like young children and other people are on the team are really excited for like getting high schoolers involved. And like, you can't put those in the same category. So if we do make the decision to have another initiative or contest, we'll have to, because I don't think that like 7-year-olds can compete or should be in the same category as like high schoolers that are like 17 or 18. So excuse me, when we make that decision, it's going to be a tough one because I think the team is split. You go ahead. Sorry about that. Whoever.
Oh, I just a mainstream example of Afrofuturism would be Black Panther and Wakanda. And my other question, this is completely separate, but how did they narrow down from 1,100 to the final group? I mean, that must have taken months.
Right. I'll start with the Wakanda. I was going to mention the Black Panther and how much of an Afrofuturist. It was a huge Afrofuturist moment because Afrofuturism has been, I don't remember the exact date when this like jazz collective was first doing like this Afrofuturist stuff with other kind of movement builders in that space, but it was like certainly before the 70s, I want to say. But I don't know the exact date on that, but it's been a while. And so it was like started as a subgenre, has been moving and gaining, you know, esteem, and, you know, more and more people knew about it. But what's her name? There's a singer, Janelle Monáe. Yeah, Janelle Monáe, like her robotic, one of her albums is very Afrofuturistic, is what people say. I'm not a fan. I just don't listen to her music. But actually her aesthetic and the thing, I know of her, obviously. So she was another moment that was like, whoa, Afrofuturism. I think Erykah Badu, in a way, has done like more of a back to earth kind of Afrofuturism in a way. But Wakanda is like a real solid example of not just only Afrofuturism, but also solar punk. It's like a black solar punk because the place Wakanda is not trying to take up tons of land. It's trying to be right relationship with the earth, but using technology in a good way. So yeah, Wakanda is a really good. Oh yeah, and there was a book by right. Whoever wrote that. Oh, Heath, thank you. Yep. And then your other question was around the production or getting to the whittling down the story as well. We have we had 3 reviewers in the first year. We actually had 4 reviewers in the second year because we realized 3 wasn't enough due to the attention the contest was getting and the submissions that were coming in. And so we have a rubric, like an internal rubric on how like we weight some of these things. So like hope is weighted high, but it's not the highest weighted. Characters, a good ending, a good beginning, because you want people to get sucked in really quickly. So a good beginning is huge. We weight that because we want you to be like into the story from the beginning. And we just have this really cool rubric that they use, that they go through, and they're reading these stories almost like a full-time job. So, which is really tough and grueling, and it's not something that I would want to be doing, but people who are like, I've invested my life in fiction and I love being in stories, they like this stuff. And they were able to commit to doing this. So, you know, each story takes to score and read about 45 minutes. That's like 20 minutes, 22 minutes to the reading, and then another 20 minutes to kind of score the rubric. And then the rubric will help the scoring. And then there's a point in the process where we swap stories so that they're double read and double scored. So it's not just one person's opinion, it's like 2 people, and then they hand them off to the judges. And basically what we do is we take the scores that the people have given. Actually, there's a third part of the process when it really gets down to 40 stories, where all 3 people read the stories, and then we're reading them too. And we can't score them, but we can comment on them in our weekly discussion. And the weekly discussion is like one of my favorite things I think I've ever done in any work environment. It's just basically discussing the story. I don't read this when we're at the 300 story level. I'm not reading the stories at that point. Sometimes I'll dip into the stories if I like heard them chatter on Slack around a particular story, just because I'm like, oh, that sounds exciting. It sounds like it might actually move up high in the process. But when we get down below, like to about 100, that's when I start reading. And then when we're talking about the stories, I'm not just asking them like, what's their opinion on some of the, what are the highlights of the stories you read? What are the ones you like? What are the, like, basically like a kudos and budos of the stories. Kudo, yes, budo, no. And yeah, so it's it's a grueling process, I would say, but it's not something that these people are professional readers and they actually jump from project to project doing this sort of thing. So they have their own tactics. They have their own little notebook that they take like notes in. Some do it on the computer, but most of them actually do handwritten notes on top of the scoring that they have to do. And like when we'll have a discussion, they'll be like, wait, that story, let me look at my notes. And then they'll recant like how they were feeling about a story at a particular time. But yeah, it's tough. It's really, I applaud them because it's not something I could do.
I think we have time for one more question if anyone has a quick one.
I have a quick question. I have a 13-year-old grandson who's very much into the environment. He's also a writer. And do you know, can you give me the title of any of these that would be appropriate for 14-year-olds that you know of that have been written?
I hit the wrong button. I hit the chat. So you can hear, I hit the chat button instead of the unmute button. Yeah, I would say the vast majority of them. There's one story that's like the #1 story from the first year, which is called Afterglow. And that's one story that if you like it has a little bit of some cyberpunk parts in it. And the character starts off like in a not a good state, like they're on the floor puking from drugs. So I would stay away from that story if that's something you don't think that they can handle. A story where a person has like a life in the beginning where they they're like in a club scene and they're, but their life, it moves up from there. But the way I would do this is just like telling you the story, because most of the stories are appropriate. So I would just say, stay away from that story.
Great.
And then that's from the first collection. It's called Afterglow. It is the best. It really is a great story. So when you do think it is appropriate for them, you could say, hey, say that again?
In a couple of years, yeah.
Yeah. And then there's another story in the first year called Tidings. And it's like vignettes. It jumps from between like 4 different they're all happening in the same era or like within decades, and they build on each other. It's really an amazing story. It's by the guy, Rich Larson, that won the Emmy. But there's like a sex scene in that story. So I'd stay away from that story too. It's called Tidings. So I think Tidings and Afterglow, if I can remember correctly, I'm trying to think really quickly. I'm pretty sure those are the only two. Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure those are the only 2 stories, and they're both from the first year that you would want to stay away from him, have him stay away from, or her.
Oh, thank you. That's great. He'll love this genre.
And the last thing I should mention before we go, and I didn't mention it before, is that you can also listen to these stories. So we hired voice actors to so they're all like accessible. So if you're walking your dog or if you're going out for a run, you can pop your earbuds in or your headphones, or you're about to go to bed and you want to listen to a 20-minute story. You can listen to the stories. Right at the top of the story will say like, listen to the story, just press the button and then it will listen. I will warn you about something that we're trying to fix for the second year. The media player, if you close the story, it won't save where you are. So that's something where we have to fix, but excuse me, the first year you can pause it, and then as long as you didn't like shut down your computer completely, it should remember where you are. Or even if you remember you were at 1532, you can advance to 1532. In this one, the new year, we're working it out. I don't know what happened. It's something we're working on, and we will have it fixed. But currently, you can't like rewind, fast forward, or pick where you were. So you have to like commit. Once you've committed, you're in.
All right. so we're at 8 o'clock, so I'm gonna go ahead and just thank everybody so much for coming out tonight. And again, thank you to Tory for talking about the project. It sounds really, really great. And again, thank you to Progress Norwood and Together Yes for partnering with us on this. And I hope that everybody has an excellent evening. Stay warm and dry tomorrow. It's supposed to be pretty nasty out there, so take care, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Tori.
Bye, everyone.